Parliament for the first National Socialist politicians in Germany, then under the banner of the National Socialist Freedom Party, to be voted into the Reichstag. And not until 1928, 10 years after Britain had its first National Socialist Member of Parliament, were candidates from a party headed by Adolf Hitler voted into a national parliament. When the National Socialist Party was founded in Britain in 1916, Adolf Hitler, the would-be leader of Germany's National Socialist Party, was still an awkward loner with fluctuating political convictions. This book tells the story of his metamorphosis into a charismatic leader and conniving political operator with firm National Socialist ideas and extremist political and anti-Semitic convictions. His transformation did not begin until 1919 and was only completed in the mid-1920s. It took place in Munich, to which Hitler had moved in 1913, a city that, compared with Silvertown and many cities in the Habsburg Empire, had remained politically stable until the end of the First World War. While this book focuses on the years between 1918 and the mid-1920s, crucial years in the life of Hitler, it likewise tells the story of National Socialism's belated success in Germany. This is also the story of the political transformation of Munich, Bavaria's capital, in which Hitler rose to prominence, a city that only a few years earlier would have been considered one of the most unlikely places for a sudden emergence and triumph of demagoguery and political turmoil. When I first became a historian, I never would have imagined that I would write at any length about Adolf Hitler. As a graduate student, I felt greatly honored, and I still do, to work in a very minor role, compiling the book's bibliography, on the first volume of Ian Kershaw's magisterial Hitler biography. Yet, after the many great works of scholarship about Hitler that had been published between the 1930s and the publication of Kershaw's biography in the late 1990s, I found it difficult to imagine that anything worthwhile and new was left to say about the leader of the Third Reich. As a German raised in the 1970s and 1980s, undoubtedly I also was driven, at least subconsciously, by a concern that writing about Hitler may appear as apologetic. In other words, that it would constitute a return to the early 1950s, when many Germans tried to blame the many crimes of the Third Reich solely on Hitler and a small number of people around him. However, by the time I finished writing my second book in the mid-2000s, I had started to see the flaws in our understanding of Hitler. For instance, I was no longer so sure that we really knew how he had become a Nazi, and hence, that we were drawing the right lessons from the story of his metamorphosis for our own times. Not that earlier historians lacked talent, quite the contrary. Some of the very best and most incisive books on Hitler had been written between the 1930s and the 1970s, but all these books could only be as good as the evidence and research available at the time, as we all necessarily stand on the shoulders of others. By the 1990s, the long dominant idea that Hitler had already become radicalized while growing up in Austria had been exposed as one of his own self-serving lies. Scholars therefore concluded that if Hitler had not been radicalized as a child and teenager in the Austrian-German borderlands, nor in Vienna as a young man, his political transformation must have come later. The new view was that Hitler became a Nazi due to his experiences in the First World War, or the combination of those with the post-war revolution that turned Imperial Germany into a republic. By the mid-2000s, that view no longer made much sense to me, as I had started to see its many flaws. Thus, I set out to write a book about Adolf Hitler's years in the First World War and the impact they had on the rest of his life. As I made my way through archives and private collections in attics and basements on 3 continents, I realized that the story Hitler and his propagandists told about his time in the war was not just an exaggeration with a true core. In fact, its very core was rotten. Hitler was not admired by his army peers for his extraordinary bravery, nor was he a typical product of the war experiences of the men of the regiment in which he served. He was not